You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars. This week I've been testing the two extremes of the 992 lineup. I began with the car that everybody wants, the GT3, and I have to say, if you're willing to commit to it, that is a car that is simply mind-altering. But I swapped it a couple of days ago for this, the Targa. And the Targa's a model which, even amongst Porschephiles, has often been misunderstood, if not downright despised, commonly for its lack of driver focus and involvement in what many see as the ultimate sports car. However, the Targa and I do have a bit of a history. In a past life, I worked for an independent Porsche specialist, and we had, amongst other things, a 964 Targa. That, of all the cars we ever had, was probably my least favourite, until I drove it. You see, I never really understood the old-style Targa top because it didn't look very good to my eyes, and there wasn't actually anywhere in the car to put it, which meant that here in the United Kingdom, you're almost certain never to take it off because there are very, very few days you trust the weather that much to leave your roof at home. However, a customer came in looking at that car and I had to take it out. And it was then that I had a revelation. I didn't care how the car looked or the fact that you're probably going to get wet eventually in it. It drove absolutely wonderfully, and the Targa top for me really did add to the experience. Later, I convinced my mother to buy a 993 Targa, a car that we did up and then moved on. And we sold that, we felt very lucky to get this amount for it, for £22,000, having spent over £8,000 doing it up. How times change. The 993, 6 and 7 generation of 911 introduced a new style of Targa that wasn't particularly well received. It was effectively an enormous oversized sunroof with a piece of glass stretching almost from side to side that would then slide back, essentially giving you the Targa experience but without having to remove or store the panel. However, the system was notoriously fickle, had a reputation for breaking frequently and in very expensive ways, and I recall when my father wanted to buy a 997, he asked about getting a Targa and was told point blank by his dealer, "Don't do it, they will rattle and then they will break." Hardly confidence inspiring. For the 991 generation of car, and continued here in the 992, Porsche decided to go a very different route with the Targa, and they've done what I think the 911 should always be about: blend the old and the new. So what you have looks very much like the old school 1970s and 80s Targas, but unlike those which had a manually removable section, this whole canopy here is fully automated and, quite honestly, a piece of automotive artwork. Historically, a 911 has never been a particularly showy car, but this is pure and simple theatre. And the Targa's looks really do give it a very unique presence on the road. Most 911s, including fairly fruity ones, go pretty much unnoticed, but the public approval on this is through the roof. In fact, I'd say it gets more looks and stares than the GT3. And the all-important small boy approval factor, which any man trying to buy a car to impress his son will know about, is sky high here. People love the Targa. I've never been a particularly big fan of the 992, and I've many reasons for this. The simple truth is that for me, the 911 is an iconic car. There is little else in the sports car world that's been around for this long and yet remains instantly recognisable. Yes, the Corvette is now in its 8th generation, but even a C5 really bears almost no resemblance to a C1. The same for Ferrari. The F8 Tributo was a deliberately nostalgic attempt to recreate some of the greatest hits of Ferrari's past, yet it wasn't a carbon copy of a 308. The BMW M3 I think really doesn't count because it's a sporty version of a regular production saloon car. Yet if you took somebody straight out of 1963 and showed them this without any badges on, they would still know it was a 911. You see, the thing is, people associate these cars with being cool because people like Steve McQueen bought them. However, Steve McQueen didn't buy it because it was cool. It became cool because Steve McQueen had one. He bought it because he liked driving. And with this car, I feel like Porsche got a little bit distracted with being cool rather than being good. Take the 991, for example, a car I didn't really want to like because the regular models moved to turbocharging and the car got quite a bit larger. However, it was still, certainly in the .2 generation, an excellent drive. The interior of the 911, for example, has rarely been a very special place compared with, say, a Bentley, a Rolls-Royce, a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. In fact, the 993 is a mess because it was an interior that hadn't changed dramatically in the 30 years the car had been in production. The 996 was pretty low rent and fairly naff, and it was only in the 997 where these cars got an interior that actually felt like a half-decent place to be. Even the 991 was simply logical and functional, not particularly special, unless you went really to town with the options list. However, with this, they really messed up. This whole cockpit is a masterpiece of form over function, the exact opposite of everything a Porsche should really be about. Where do we even start? Well, let's begin with the bit that you look at, the dashboard. In the middle, you have a nice analog, if desperately retro, tachometer. That I don't mind. But it's flanked by a pair of screens, half of which you cannot see because the steering wheel obscures it, including the all-important temperature and fuel gauge over here. This, to me, is frankly baffling. As it happens, this little button here is genius because whatever mode you're in, if you press it, it will give you 20 seconds of absolutely everything in maximum attack, making it ideal for quick overtakes when you weren't otherwise pressing on. Moving to the middle, you have this very, very odd area that is, quite honestly, a catalogue of errors. The Braun shaver, which looks frankly like a child's toy, is absolutely pathetic, both to look at and to use. Entirely unintuitive and really not the sort of thing you should find in a proper sports car. Even some of Porsche themselves agree with me on that one, because in the GT3 you'll find a much more traditional lever. It is an ergonomic and visual disaster. You see, in most normal automatic cars, to move into manual mode, you simply click the lever left, something you can do without taking your eyes off the road. But here you have to press a button, which is right next to the parking brake. Now, I doubt it's going to let you actually put it into park on the motorway, but it's still very, very stupid. You have the same thing over here for the window controls. All of the buttons for the wing mirror controls and the window are flush and level. Now, the windows you can sort of feel and tell where they are. I guarantee you that more or less whatever it is that you actually drive, the wing mirror switches will be far more intuitive. Just think about it for a moment. I bet they are. Moving back to the centre, you have the lint moat around the gear lever, a nice little function to really give your detailer something to worry about, and then a totally inexplicable piece of glossy black plastic either side. Now, in other cars they actually have some buttons there, so it serves some sort of purpose, but here you don't. Then you have the absolutely atrocious cup holder, a shame and a travesty compared to the gorgeous pieces of art that came before it, and it also gets in the way of the handbrake down here. The centre display here is the now obligatory touchscreen. I'm grateful that Porsche have at least left some physical controls for the cabin air temp and fan, but everything else is accessed through the menu up there. And it's quite frankly baffling. What's really confusing is the fact that it's not actually the exact same system as in the GT3 I just handed back. And I'm not sure which one is the newer. For 2022, Porsche are apparently finally introducing Android Auto. Why that wasn't in their cars a long time ago, I really do not know, and that seems like a very, very strange oversight for a car made in this day and age. That is not to say, of course, the car is without merit. The steering wheel is absolutely perfectly sized and fits in the hand really nicely. Though these gear levers here are not as big as I would like, the action is pleasant enough, and in a regular 911, I think they're okay, but in the GT3, not quite up to scratch. The seats also are the adjustable 18-way sports items, and they really do have as many ways to adjust as you can possibly imagine. Luckily, they are rather comfortable and supportive and pretty decent on longer journeys. The Bose stereo in here is also one of the few options this car actually has and does a pretty decent job. But for audiophiles, I'd say the Burmester is an option well worth having. As you can tell from the comically long badge on the back, this is the Porsche 911 Targa 4 GTS. That means this is currently the top of the Targa tree. Porsche, as far as I'm aware, have never made a Targa Turbo. Oddly, last year we got a special edition Targa, the Heritage Design Edition, and that didn't actually use the GTS as its base, instead having the 4S. The interior of that car did feel a little bit more special, had some rather unusual material choices. Porsche trying to bring corduroy back, apparently. The GTS is currently, and likely to remain, the best equipped and most powerful version of the Targa. As it happens, this car has a list price of about £1,000 less than the GT3 I just drove, although as we all know in the real world, if you do want to buy a GT3, you're going to be paying quite a bit more. Most interestingly, as the Heritage Edition is now finished, several people are trying to sell those on the second-hand market for a significant premium. Porsche Silverstone themselves even had one for sale at £180,000, which I think is rather daft for a car that wasn't even that much of a limited edition. They made 992 of those, and I'd be surprised if they sold that many of these here in the UK at least. Thanks to the base Porsche lineup now being all turbocharged, this car actually has near GT3 levels of power as well. From its 3-litre, twin-turboed, twin-intercooled flat 6, you get 480 horsepower in the GTS, 510 in the GT3, and 420 pound-foot of torque. That's 570 newton meters. That's about 20% up on the GT3, although unsurprisingly, because of the massive weight penalty, this is in practice quite a bit slower if you're into the numbers thing. And if you are into the numbers thing, we should probably talk about options. This car has in total around £12,000 worth, which I have to say is actually quite reasonable in the world of the sports car today. And it's split between things which you would expect to be options, like the upgraded and very good LED headlights, the Bose stereo and the fancier seats, and stuff which really shouldn't be optional at all, like the electric folding mirrors for £240, and my personal least favourite, the GTS interior, which I hate for 3 reasons. First off, it is a GTS, so why isn't the GTS interior standard? Secondly, it's basically contrast stitching and a bit of extra Alcantara. That should be a few £100 option, not the £3,000 that it is. And finally, you don't actually even get the contrast stitch on the steering wheel. The one thing you're looking at all the time doesn't have it. Finding a direct rival for a 911 has always been a very difficult task. With the Targa, it's nearly impossible. But there are a few cars that I've experienced recently which I think will provide a good yardstick for it. You could pick up something like the Mercedes SL63, now discontinued, but for half the price of the Targa, you could get a reasonably late, very well-equipped example of a car that is another premium convertible with a proper folding hardtop. You've also got a selection of Jaguar F-Types in both 4, 6 and 8-cylinder guises, and for the same price as one of these new, you could get a fully optioned 575 horsepower F-Type R and about 25 grand in your back pocket. Then at sort of just a bit more money, you could get a used Ferrari Portofino, or for quite a bit more money, you could get a Portofino M. So there is, in theory, a lot of competition out there. You might also consider an Aston Martin, but I haven't driven any of the new generation of convertibles, so I can't draw direct comparisons. Handily, unlike the GT3 I drove last week, this is a car that in theory you can simply walk into any Porsche dealer, place an order for and buy. So then, should you? Given my history with the 992, this would be the part where you might reasonably expect me to give it a complete drubbing. However, the Targa 4 GTS is in fact a car that possesses many fine qualities, so let's talk about some of those. We'll begin with perhaps the most important part for many, the engine and gearbox, where both are not just good, they're excellent. The gearbox in particular is one area I had a real problem with the regular car, because unlike the 7-speed PDK that came before, this new 8-speed didn't really seem to know what it wanted to do. Every single thing you asked of it was met with an unusually long delay. This appears to have vanished with the GTS, and also with the Turbo S that I drove off camera last year. In automatic mode, if you were to criticize this for anything, you might say it's just a little bit too keen to change gear. Sport mode in particular, you'll be going along and you want to make a very sensible overtake without needing too much throttle, and often you'll find the car changing down 2, 3, sometimes even 4 gears, and it feels often quite unnecessary. But slip the car into manual mode and you'll find that at all times it responds both smoothly and briskly. Manual mode is also the place where you'll get the best feel of what this engine is all about. From about 1 to 2,000 RPM, it does struggle. However, from 2 to 4, it pulls with a real ferocity. However, get the engine spinning beyond about 4,000 RPM and it responds in a way that is not quite, but very close to naturally aspirated. Even more pleasingly, get it to around 5,000 RPM and it picks up pace in a way that is very alien to the vast majority of turbocharged lumps. The last 500 RPM is even accompanied by a very distinct and noticeable increase in volume, which means that this car has a quality very few modern cars do. When you've got the windows down and you've got all the air rushing around you, you can actually still hear it. And more than that, you know when you need to change gear. You also cannot deny the pace of this thing. Let me show you what I mean about that last 500 RPM change in the sound. Hear it? Let me give it to you again. Quite addictive, that. This thing gets from A to B in a manner that really belies the extra weight the Targa format carries. It's not really much of a surprise though that a modern twin turbocharged engine is quite pokey. What is really rather pleasing is the suspension. In the tradition, it seems now, of modern Porsches, particularly the higher performance variants, at low speeds it is a little bit firmer than you might like. That being said, when I got into this out of the GT3, the effect was like stepping onto a magic carpet, having just been dragged by a horse for the last 100 miles. That probably tells you as much about the GT3 as it does about this. However, in a moment we shall take it down one of my most demanding sections of test road, and you'll see that it actually handles itself really rather well. Unlike some of the other GTS models, the Targa is available only with a 10mm drop rather than the usual 20. It also has helper springs fitted at the rear, much like in the GT3. As we're in town though, allow me to talk about one of the things I really don't like about the 992 that also applies here. One of the highlights of most 911s is the fact that they are actually a very compact car, very easy to place, very easy to enjoy, even on a road that is somewhat narrow. They shine on the sort of road where your average supercar would simply feel out of its depth. But in the seemingly unending quest for improvement, the 911 seems to be a victim of its own success. This car has grown to the point where it now feels genuinely intimidating to drive. It's not helped by the fact that the bonnet now no longer possesses that classic 911 silhouette. That bit over there I can't really place. I can only do it because I've got a camera there, and most people won't be speccing these with the optional camera stuck on the end of the bonnet. I've driven this route in a number of cars. In fact, I've just driven a 612 Scaglietti that you might have noticed following me for a moment, and that felt narrower than this. That says a lot, I think. Back then to that suspension. This road is a real test of any car. It'll do two things. First off, because there's quite an aggressive camber with a lot of little dips and bumps on the side, if your car's suspension and steering are too hyperactive, it'll simply feel like it's trying to drag you off into the hedge at every given moment. Secondly, this section here, if your car's not set right, you will smack the ground in a very, very unpleasant way. This though, driven it a couple of times through there now, and it's absolutely sensational. No issues whatsoever. It can put a smile on your face when the mood takes you, this car. It really, really can. Let's then talk about something else, and one area that I think this car isn't quite so good. Steering. It is, I believe, a little bit better than the Carrera. However, it's still far from brilliant. It's got a nice weighting to it. In fact, I'd say in a lot of circumstances, it feels a bit too heavy. It does seem to weighten up in the bends, and the chassis and steering work together to give you a real confidence. I've yet to find this car's limits, and I assume they are ridiculously high. Only a couple of times have I felt the chassis really moving at all, and when it has, the four-wheel drive system has intervened nicely, smoothly, picked up the slack, and you've just kept going. It's never felt anything other than rock steady. If you want your 911 to have that classic sort of bob and weave and very sort of wandering front end, you're not going to find it here. In fact, if you like your steering to have any sort of real feedback, it is sadly entirely absent. It also raises, I think, a really key point about the 992 because, as maybe alluded to earlier, this setup here has a ludicrous amount of things that you can change. In fact, this car has the Sports Chrono Pack, and you can set by what percentage it will allow you to deviate from your line on a track before discounting the lap. You've got all sorts of different things you can change, but there's a few things missing, including a setting for steering feel. I think there'd be a lot of people who would find this far too heavy to want to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, when I've been using this car on more normal journeys, simply commuting, I would say actually the steering is a bit too heavy. Because it's electric, there'd be absolutely nothing stopping them having a comfort setting for it to lighten it up. I don't know why they don't offer that. Likewise, the annoyingly placed handbrake button down here, I haven't yet found an option to get that to turn on automatically. So why have they made it then so inaccessible? Also, the heating. This being a Targa convertible type thing, your legs do often get a little bit chilly. That's just the way these things work. Now, they've got some vents down here, which is nice, but there are no vents up here, so your left hand does get quite cold, and so do your feet. They have, in the climate control screen, an option to make the footwell cooler than the rest of the car, but there isn't one to make it warmer. Why? Why not? I don't know. More good things then. The scuttle shake is not actually that bad. It is there, it is detectable, but only really in trace quantities. At no point during the sort of 1,000 miles I've put on this car already have I gone, oh, bit scuttle shaky there. It's absolutely fine. That's really not a problem. That's a very timely reminder to talk about something I'd nearly forgotten. This car's had its tyres set to a few PSI under what Porsche recommend, and I assume this has been done deliberately. I'm sure Porsche didn't send me out in a car with less tyre pressure than it should have. This thinks it's got nearly half a bar less than it should, but it's already at 2.5. That's already reasonably high. Most cars I'd run at sort of closer to 2. So if you put nearly 3 bar in this, that's well over 40 PSI, and that's not exactly odd because a lot of Porsches run that, yet it keeps pinging at me and telling me I need to put more air in it. It's very frustrating. I haven't worked out a way yet to tell it to go away. I'm sure there is, but if Porsche have sent the car out like that, that does tell you they think with the full amount of pressure in, it's probably a little bit too firm. Never mind. It doesn't get in the way of your fun, so I'm not really that worried about it, and let's enjoy this car just a little bit more. So long ago, this is the kind of power you would expect to find in a fully fledged turbo model. It's absolutely mad what this car can do. But, and you knew there was a but coming, didn't you? This car has one really big problem, and it might be a deal breaker. the roof. You may have noticed that I've got this window sort of a couple of inches down. There's a very good reason for that. You see, if I put, I'm going to turn this car into automatic mode for a moment, if I put the windows up, I'm not sure to what extent it comes through clearly on camera, but if you have the windows all the way up, there is a lot of buffeting in here. At motorway speeds in particular, it's very distracting, rather unpleasant, very low frequency kind of type sort of noise. If you then put the windows all the way down, it fixes that, but then you get just general wind in the cabin and you get kind of chilly. It gets worse, I'm afraid, because if you then drive this with the roof up or closed, however you want to describe it, it rattles a lot. The rear section has a really bad rattle. This door also seems to have a rattle, and the dash may as well, but I think that could be one of the other rattles getting reflected. It's bad. In fact, in a £140,000 car, it's downright unforgivable. And here's the thing about the Targa. You see, had you asked me about 2 days ago to deliver a verdict on this car, I would have gone, nope, terrible, awful, I don't like it. But we've had some very, very pleasant weather. It's March, it's Britain. This is wrong. Someone's filled out the paperwork all wrong. This is not the weather we're supposed to get. I assume this means August is going to be absolutely horrendous. But when the weather is like this, it means you can really enjoy the car. The presence of some extra wind in the cabin isn't really much of an issue. Try and drive this like I do my S2000, so roof down even when it's about 8 degrees, and you're going to freeze. You definitely need a jacket on for that. You also have to remember that you cannot put this roof up or down on the move. You also got to be really careful about where you park the car, because the roof actually extends sort of beyond the bodywork. So it's very easy to hit the car behind you, which I nearly did yesterday, with the roof. And I'd hate to be the person who would have to explain that to an insurance company. What happened? My roof hit another car. How fast were you going? I was parked. Were you drunk? No, honest. Was your car? And remember earlier I mentioned this car has several potential rivals. I think I would have nearly every single one of them over this. The Jaguar F-Type, for example, that has an utterly bombastic power plant. That supercharged V8 is utterly sublime. I drove one the other day immediately after hopping out the F12, and still it felt savage. It's also a rather fun car, has better steering than this, feels a little bit easier to place, and it's a Jag, which means you'll have just a generally easier time with it wherever you go. Then we look at, say, the SL63, and with the 5.5 litre bi-turbo engine, it's got more than enough poke. It also has better response more of the time than this, and to me, does a better job of conveying the feeling of being premium. Yes, the infotainment is way out of date compared to this, but the sense of occasion and luxury, I think, is far greater. That car is riddled with so many different features that make it feel like it is a cut above. The new SL, I'm not exactly sure what it is Mercedes are trying, but when it comes out, we shall have to wait and see. I don't get on with the Mercedes, so I'm unlikely to drive one for quite some time. Then on the other side of things, let's look at, say, the Ferrari Portofino. That's also a very broad car, has steering probably worse than this, but an engine that's even better, a rampant 3.9 litre twin turbocharged unit related to the one in the 488, and it rides, I think, even better. Of course, even the ropiest Portofino is going to cost you a lot more to buy than one of these. It will cost you a lot more in fuel, although Ferrari do counter that with having a 4-year warranty, but more impressively, a 7-year service plan. So until the car is 7 years old, service costs, not really something you have to worry about. Most of the people that have seen the Targa while I've been out and about in it, including those who've come to me for a review, have been really impressed with it. It has wowed them, and that is something that not many 911s, particularly not the common or garden variety 911, can do. So I suppose in many ways this really is a very, very good car. great engine, very good gearbox, extremely quick point-to-point, a suspension that is surprisingly supple when you begin to press on. Another item this car does very well, and traditional Porsche strong point, is the brakes. This has the standard steel items, and for me, they seem absolutely fine. I can see why a few people don't like them, because you do have to press the pedal a little more than you might expect to get them to stop the car, but that's pretty common to many a Porsche. And there is a moment when you've begun to slow the car down where it seems like the brakes are running out of power. Push through that though and you'll find a pedal which is linear, responsive, and more than capable of bringing this car to a stop no matter how quick you were going. The car then overall is dynamically very good, but £140,000 is a lot of money. And if you lived in America, south of Spain, Italy, somewhere that it's so warm you really don't worry about having the windows down with the roof, I think it would be okay. But we don't live there. We live in a country where it's rarely like this, certainly in March. And that means that the one thing about the Targa, which is really its party piece, is also its biggest weakness. So although I'd say I've warmed to this in a way that I didn't the regular Carrera, if you are considering one of these, please do make sure you get an extended test drive, because I think there's enough in this car that might put people off. It is worth a proper go before you commit. A very big thank you to Porsche for lending me this car for a little bit longer than usual. It has actually been a real help and allowed me to get under the skin a little bit more than I normally might. Thanks to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we shall see you all for the next one. Bye bye.